If you followed this series from beginning to end, you should now have a very different view of Egypt than you had when you started watching the series. Egypt is not a civilization barely emerging out of primitivism, worshipping an incoherent pantheon of gods and devoid of science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and so on. It is, in fact, a civilization in all important respects more advanced than ourselves, from which we have much to learn and not so much to contribute. The overriding theme behind Egypt, that fueled Egypt through 3,000 years of almost uninterrupted peace, prosperity, and religion, was the doctrine of immortality, the idea that we human beings are of divine origin, and through our own internal efforts we can re-establish within ourselves that connection, and ourselves become divine. The embodiment of that principle was the Pharaoh himself. And here we see Ramses II, one of the very greatest of the Egyptian pharaohs, certainly its most prodigious builders, proclaiming himself in that guise. So here at Abu Simbel, on the great days of October 22nd and February 22nd, supposedly the birthday and coronation day of the king himself, we see a phenomenon that is, you might call, the physical manifestation of illumination. So here at Abu Simbel, we will be looking at this principle of immortality, at the sacred science, at the idea of illumination, which is not contingent upon electricity, as our modern scholars seem to think.
Tale hidden in the stones, blueprints of a lost art from a lost world. Behind the veil lies another Egypt, hidden in Egypt, magical Egypt.
A work of stupendous magnitude and quite incredible perfection. It marks the furthest southern extent of the Egyptian Empire during the time of Ramses, which is about 11 something. He reigned for 66 years, so it's most of the 12th century, or a big chunk of the 12th century. The reasons for building it here, well, it marks as I said, it marks the southern extent of the empire, and he's not exactly saying beware. He's not really saying, I mean, the king is not, it looks like boasting, but it's not boasting. Basically what he's saying is that here the forces of light begin. What it represents esoterically is, and this is by common agreement as well, I mean the Egyptologists wouldn't really disagree with that, it's the king as a god, the king as the realization, put it this way, the king as the realization of the divine principle during his lifetime. I think that's what makes this temple unique. always the king is of divine birth. That's part of the canon, part of the metaphysical doctrine. From the very beginnings of Egypt, that's there. What Ramses seems to be saying here is that he has achieved divinity within his lifetime.
The Temple of Abu Simbel is a marvel of engineering and a masterpiece of symbolic architecture. The temple was engineered to commemorate the birthday and coronation day of the pharaoh. It is aligned in such a way as to capture the first rays of the rising sun on these two special days.
And if you're here on that day, actually the day itself is always an absolute zoo. And the place is always full, as you have to get here at 4:30 in the morning to even be close to the head of the line. But if you get there and watch this, you know, this was a very good lighting man at work who comes up in the east. And this thing, I mean, you're sitting there in the darkness and it's getting a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter. And then all of a sudden the sun gets over the horizon. If it's a clear day nowadays, not every day is clear, and it just goes, bah! It lights up like that. And everybody everyone in the temple goes, ah! And then you watch, it takes about 15 minutes for it to sweep across and light up the four gods in turn. And it is quite an experience.
The light penetrates the temple to its very core and lights the four deity statues within.
Ja.
What it is, it's a clock. It's frozen time. That's what they are. I mean, it is marking, or it is commemorating a time, and the time is the coronation of the king, or some argue his birth. But what the architect did is that he used time, and time is astronomy. Time is position of the sun. So he locks the temple to time. But not just that. I mean, he's simply not pointing the temple to the sunrise on that particular day, which is the 22nd of October. He is also using what the sun does on that day, at its rising, in order to tell the story. So he's designed it as such, so that it works in this way. He's put symbols that represents the first activity of the sun, the baboons, as I explained, at the top of the temple, and so forth. So finally, when the light strikes at the right position, in perfect conjunction with the axis, he gets the apotheosis. The apotheosis is that the king is divinized. That's the whole idea. The whole idea of a king is to confirm his divinity and to renew his divinity at the Jubilees. So that's what this temple does. It still does it without the priesthood, without the king, because it's frozen.
The temple is frozen in time, as is the understanding of the underlying patterns and rules of the universe. The temples are permanent repositories describing the mysteries and the interconnection between them in that other vast mirror realm, our consciousness.
The statuary represents the living people at the time. They truly believe this. And in many ways, one could argue that they do. As I explained yesterday, these statues are not statues, they're talismans. They are regarded as having absorbed the essence of the principles they represent. And they do, because what he's achieved is that the king essence, as the divine king, as the Horus king, is the sun. But his transmission, his coming to earth at a specific time, which we call the 22nd of October, was when the sun was in this position. So in short, the statue becomes alive, if you like, and becomes the essence of the sun on that day. He's achieved that design. Or let's put it this way, he's achieved the nearest one can with architecture to express this.
Author Robert Bauval explores the significance of temples as magical technology in his upcoming book, Talisman.
In short, the temple is only stone if you don't understand its symbolism. And the temple is only stone if you do not integrate with it. No, it's merely pretty or evocative. But that's not what it's supposed to be. The temple is a talisman that needs to be activated by your presence. Today here we're standing alone in the temple of Abu Simbel. Incredible situation. We're being affected partially by the symbolism we see, by the harmony of the architecture, but in no way to the degree that an initiate, a full initiate would be. In short, we're inside the hardware, but we're not charged. We're the software that has not been initiated. Whereas had you been initiated in the fullest sense of Egyptian initiation, temple initiation, then you would have been a software which is programmed to interact with the temple. You wouldn't be here talking to me, you'd be exalting with the statuaries and the symbolism. You would explode here, intellectually and spiritually.
Hieroglyphs, as an expression of high ancient symbolism, are the crossing of language and magic. This very misunderstood technology works with the brain of the initiate to evoke a dense and richly complicated web or matrix of meanings and associations. Hieroglyphs are charged. They are collapsed ideas. In some cases, they can be entire schools collapsed into a single image. To the initiate, to that person who has been given the keys to understanding the many visual and geometric clues, the hieroglyphs are magical talismans, each capable of exploding into a whirlwind of ideas, associations, understandings, lessons, deep and mysterious arcana. Hieroglyphs are even employed as a repeatable means of rapidly evoking unusual states of consciousness.
Symbolism isn't something that is simply told by a teacher to a pupil. Part of it is, but the major labor of understanding a symbol is to experience it. So it takes a long, long time. I may try to explain to you till I'm blue in the face what my symbol means. I'm wearing, for example, an ankh and a Christian talisman. But even though I may explain it to you, I still wouldn't be able to project to you my fullest feeling about what this means to me, the experience that brought me to wear this, and what it causes in me intellectually and spiritually when I do consider the talisman, very often touch it. The only way is that you are me and have experienced the same thing. So you need to experience. And therefore we learn more and more about symbols. We learn more and more about the temple. You could come here, for hundreds of times. But as you can see, it's loaded with details, and every detail is charged with this kind of meaning. You're not come to. The idea is not to sort of wander around and take a few photographs and go out. The idea is to stay here and meditate at corners, to ponder on the meaning of the symbols that you see, on the sceneries, on the reliefs, on the effects of light. And it will take you years to discharge the information of the temple into your mind, so that when you do finally reach that stage, you are completely one with the temple. Then you can move faster, but then the speed of your understanding, the trigger that is unleashed every time you pass next to a symbol, works faster.
Like computers' use of hierarchy, hieroglyphs are icons. They are folders, containing as much as we have loaded into the folders through the process of successive initiations. They are magical icons which command and cause the desired brain state. They are programs which perform to the extent that we have installed the upgrades.
Like the comparison between a Pentium 1 and a Pentium 4. If you see the analogy, you start here being totally unprogrammed, and you begin slowly to be programmed. And the temple becomes more active because you are more receptive. Till finally you've got a hardware which has the capacity of a Pentium 4 or whatever you call it, and you are a program that is perfectly designed to interact with that speed. And you discharge your initiation, and the temple discharge, and you both interact to produce this ultimate result of full understanding by simply looking at the objects. The temple becomes like a silent teacher, and you are the perfect pupil. The whole idea of statuary, the whole idea of temples, but take statuary as a more obvious example, is not the way we see it as artwork. It is artwork in the sense that it is magnificently carved and pleasing to see, but to them a statue was the body, the permanent body. They chose materials that would last, in order for the talismanic qualities of the principle, be it the king or be it a divinity, to inhabit. Now, how did they do this? It wasn't a question of hocus pocus, of saying, I made a statue of the king and therefore the king isn't here. They fed it, in a sense, with meaning. The same way we would create meaning in an object. Many people have talisman without being aware of it. You know, a wedding ring, a favorite teddy bear, These are talismans because they are fed with meaning. So the object is not just an object, it is imbued with meaning. So this is how they did it. They fed it with meaning, so that when an initiate would come into the temple, he would not see the statue, he would see the representation of the king with all its qualities, the essence of the principle. The principle may be the stars, maybe the flood of the Nile, maybe the king, maybe a divinity, maybe an idea. You know, an object. You may be wearing a ring because it represents your fraternity at university. But therefore, this ring is imbued with the idea of your membership to this fraternity, all the people who belong to it, the friendships that you made there, the experiences that you had. So that ring to you has that meaning. When you see that ring, you see beyond it. That's how they thought. They realized correctly that the mind responds to this kind of objects, to talismans. And talismans can be anything: statues, temples, even natural objects. A flower. When you think of a flower that is given on the day of you propose to your future wife, she takes the flower, she dries it and puts it in a book. Sees the flower 20 years later, bam, she breaks into tears, right? That's the power of imbuing. That's how it works. That's how we are made to work. They cleverly understood this, and they cleverly combined it with architecture. So architecture becomes the material expression of the immaterial force of talisman. Architecture is meant for that. It's not meant to make blocks so we can go and work in offices. Architecture is they used to call it the royal art because it was for architecture was for religious purposes. They didn't consider architecture when you build a hut and live there. This is not architecture. What we call architecture isn't. To them, the notion of designing a temple was in the hands of those who were initiated to do so. They were priests, they were astronomers, they were those who had studied symbols, they were magicians. And the product of their labor is these temples. An architect isn't simply a guy who designs shapes. He's a man who imbues in his design the culture idea behind the building, be it a temple, be it a church, be it a cathedral, even be it a bank. If he succeeds in that, then he's achieved his objective. Otherwise, he's merely creating a box or a sphere or whatever he's doing. There is a whole game of light. I mean, getting down to the basics of physics. And as I explained, the temple is aligned in such a way that it receives light at specific times of the year and of the day in order to activate the various parts of the temple, the various symbols. It is a symphony of light that is frozen for most of the year and becomes active, defrosts on the 22nd of October. So if you're here on that day and you are initiated, better still if you were the king, if you were Ramses II and you would come here, this temple is the material and symbolic representation of yourself, of your life, of your coronation, of your birth, of your achievement. Can you imagine the effect that the king had when he came here on that day and integrated with the solar light, with the temple and with himself? He must have blown his mind to tremendous exaltation.
The favored explanation, and I think probably the most likely to be true, is that these days correspond to the birthday and coronation day of Ramses, because they don't have any astronomical significance. It's not a solstice, it's not an equinox, it's not a cross quarter. It has no special astronomical significance, but it does have that particular personal significance.
The coronation day might be seen as the day that the king received the light. The presence of four figures and their divine attributions is itself the sacred and revered revelation of the Tetragrammaton, the primal formula for cyclic life and the foundation of the universe.
So here at Abu Simbel, on the great days of October 22nd and February 22nd, supposedly the birthday and coronation day of the king himself, we see a phenomenon that is, you might call, the physical manifestation of illumination. What happens here is, as the sun rises, it gets above the horizon, shoots through the nave of this extraordinary temple, and illuminates in turn the four figures of Ptah, Amun, the king, and Ra-Horakhti. There's a cosmological and also an internal lesson to be learned from this. Straight down the shaft there and pans across the four figures in the sanctuary in sequence. And the sequence is Ptah on this side, then Amun, then the king, and then Ra-Horakhti. And why those four, or in that sequence, I think I know, and that is that it's again like, as at Abydos, it's a total cosmology written into the figures of the gods and the king. Ptah is architect of heaven and earth. Amun is the animating spirit of the universe. The king represents the synthesis of, let's say, of organic creation, and Ra-Horakhti, it's a fusion of Ra and Horus, the solar principle, and Horus, the principle of salvation, of return to the source, represents the ability of humanity to again become divine. So it goes in a sequence. In other words, it's a progression from creation of universe to return of humanity to its divine source. So, and there are four of them here because they represent the four cardinal directions and the four elements in all likelihood, the four square of matter.
Illumination is experienced by all who grasp the symbolism presented here. The light of consciousness connects the four inner deities with the outer four. The illumination is the recognition of the connectedness of the inner world with the outer.
Go inside and you'll see in the first hall the 8 figures, the king as Osiris, the 8 figures of them. And then on either wall, on that wall, the Battle of Kadesh. No one's 100% certain how real this battle is, but it's probably one of those instances where symbolism conforms to the actual history. And the story is that the king is in the company of his 4 armies he's got the armies of Ptah, Amun, Ra, and Set, interestingly enough. And he's with his armies, but he's out in a couple of informers come from the enemy, or the Hittites in this case. And they say that the Hittites have all flown camp, they're afraid of him. You know, he can march in by himself and sort of claim the victory. So these are actually spies. And so he goes in advance of his own armies, all by himself, and suddenly there's the enemy. He's trapped, they've got him. So he launches this immense prayer to Amun, very poetic prayer, to Amun, who comes to his aid and single-handed he slays 100,000 of the enemy and throws them into the river. And then his armies catch up with him, and so written into that northern wall is the whole story of this of this battle, and it's very intricately wrought, and there still seems to be quite a bit of Amarna influence there. So it's rather more lively and animated than you would expect out of strictly classical. You know, this is quite a time. You know, this is a good 50 or 60 years after Akhenaten, maybe even a bit more. Still, you see that Amarna style here. The story itself, actually, it's very interesting. The way that, just as the Isis Osiris Horus myth is retold in the Hamlet story, and the Hamlet story is all over the world. After all, Shakespeare didn't invent Hamlet; he's got it. It takes place in Denmark because he has it as a Danish folk tale. But in this case, the story of, very close to the story of Ramses and the Battle of Kadesh resurfaces in that horrible book, allegorical book Pilgrim's Progress, which is almost unreadable. And that in turn surfaces, I don't know how many of you know this, in High Noon. High Noon, the great Gary Cooper. It's Gary Cooper, isn't it? In High Noon? Yeah. It's Gary Cooper. One of the great westerns of all time is actually based upon, very closely follows the progression of Pilgrim's Progress, in which all his friends desert him and he has to do it all by himself, and he makes, you know, there's a big prayer and God comes to his aid, and you know, he ends up winning the battle in the great shootout at the OK Corral. In this case, the OK Corral is Kadesh in Syria. These ideas have percolated down through history after Egypt fell, in fragmented form, sometimes degenerate, sometimes debased, sometimes running off tangentially, but nevertheless keeping that flame alive. It's a peculiar thing that over the course of the last century, and now the beginnings of the 21st, a number of extraordinary scholars, scientists, teachers, esotericists have succeeded in putting together, in reformulating that ancient doctrine in a way that makes it not only comprehensible, but to a considerable extent comprehensive. We now have at our fingertips the potential material to reformulate that ancient doctrine in a manner commensurate to our 21st century minds, which are, perhaps unfortunately, largely rationalistic. It's what Schwaller de Lubitsch called thinking with the heart, is an essential of understanding what went on in the past, and equally essential in attempting to reestablish another civilization based upon the same principles, but undoubtedly very different in outward form and aspect.
You know, in magic, you can't even ignore puns and plays on words, because words themselves are magical tools. And when we talk about hieroglyphs as talismanic objects, it is not too far-fetched to treat hieroglyphs as logos. They're magical logos. And of course, logos in Greek means the word. Okay, the transmitting power of the universe. Because everything in the universe is connected to everything else. It's not far-fetched, and it's highly permissible in magic to incorporate puns in your understanding of the universe around you. The reason I'm bringing the word pun up is because When we're talking about the talismanic virtues of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, or hieroglyphs in general, we may as well use the modern term, they're logos. In the same way as corporate logos communicate a vast amount of information in a cute, easy to remember image. Where the puns come in is the Greek word for the word, or the communicating entity of the universe is logos. And that's exactly what the magical hieroglyphs are acting as. They are the word. They're communicating much, much more than just one or two ideas. They're literally vibrating with the vibration that holds the universe together, that's responsible for creation. Hieroglyph is a logo. A hieroglyph is a logos. A talisman is an inanimate object that someone makes animate. That's the broad definition of the term. In magic, a talisman is endowed with specific magical properties. It's different than an amulet. An amulet is something you wear as a protection against something else. A talisman is something that someone actually endows with magical force of a specific nature. It could be something just as simple as a sentimental object or souvenir of some kind that when you look at it years later, it evokes an emotional response. A perfect example of a talisman is a piece of paper that upon which you draw many symbols of a particular spiritual force of some kind, planetary, zodiacal, elemental. And then you charge that piece of paper with a magical ceremony. You go through literally a traumatic experience, a good traumatic experience, both with yourself and the object that you're turning into a talisman. Afterwards, it's charged with that force and should theoretically attract to it all harmonious energies. I'm carrying many talismans with me right now. As a matter of fact, I could dump my wallet out and show you a few talismans. Magicians usually make planetary talismans to perhaps change or amend their own astrological charts if they have difficulties in their astrological charts. Say they want to get on the good side of the moon because the moon is afflicted or something in their chart, they would construct a moon talisman, and they would start by collecting all the symbols that are sacred to the moon and all the colors, all the even sounds and smells. The talisman can be incense. Anything that evokes that auto response is a talismanic object. Even your best putter, if you're a golfer, the putter that you perform miracles with is in a way a talismanic object. Another thing that a talisman is often confused with is a panticle. The panticle is the magician's is a diagram of the magician's total understanding of the universe. In other words, it's a symbolic picture of the magician's world view. Talismans can be a part of a panticle. The tarot, the 78 cards of the tarot, could be a panticle. Actually, it's a mercurial panticle. The 78 cards of the tarot are often called the Book of Thoth, or the Book of Thoth, the Egyptian Mercury. The tarot is a panticle in that it becomes a mandala of the entire universe. You can put everything in the universe within those cards. But the individual cards themselves are more in the nature of a talisman, because they represent specific forces within the universe, isolated, cozy, all in one neat little package. A talisman is a neat little package of spiritual force. Even the alphabet, the individual letters of the alphabet, are talismans in a way, because they convey to us, or can convey to us, far greater, far more profound meanings than just the A, B, C, D, E. The Hebrew alphabet in particular is almost hieroglyphic in nature, in that the individual letter not only stands for the letter, the consonant sound itself, but an object of some kind. Aleph means ox, but it also is the number 1. But imagine all of the things that ox means, though. It's just not the beast. It represents power and fertility and all sorts of other things. And if you learn the Hebrew alphabet at the same time that you're learning all of these other collateral meanings, then it becomes rich in meaning, universal meanings. And as you see the individual words made out of individual letters, whether you know it or not, you're still processing all of that information. I'll give you the example of my first experience with talismans, which was actually my first magical operation. I wanted to get on the good side of the moon, because my astrological chart is such that if I got on the good side of the moon, life might be a little bit easier for me. So I made a moon talisman, and in order to do it, I had to learn all of the magical processes that I would learn for the rest of my magic career. I gathered up all of the moon symbols. I found out what gods of all cultures were sacred to the moon, what the lunar colors were, what the traditional angels, archangels, and divine names of the moon. I learned how to use India ink, and I learned how to be an artist, okay? And I made the most beautiful little lunar talisman that I could possibly. It was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And I consecrated it and baptized it in the middle of the night under a full moon with the dew that had formed on the top of my 1950 Chrysler Windsor. And then I tucked it away in a little linen bag, and it was just so beautiful that process in and of itself changed my life. I then made the remaining 6 planetary talismans over a period of about 6 months, and those too were the most beautiful things that I'd ever created by my hand. But when they were all through, what was I to do with them? Am I going to carry them around in my shoe? Well, a couple of them I did, you know. But I can't say that there was any hard, fast, did my dreams change? Yes, but perhaps my dreams were going to change anyway. One afternoon, it was my birthday, and I was sitting in my little home temple. Constance and my 3-year-old son, Jean-Paul, were getting ready in the kitchen for birthday cake and such. And I had a strange sort of little experience. I looked at these talismans and I laid them out in a nice little order. And for me, they represented ordering my life. Something in my life was beautiful. Something in my life was ordered. And as always, I was, you know, having terrible financial troubles and such, and a bit depressed. But in a way, they cheered me up, because I had something in my life that was perfect. It then occurred to me that these talismans would never be more perfect, and that this moment would never be more perfect. And I went on an inner trip of how can I preserve these talismans for the future? And the answer was, I can't. They're going to grow old. They're going to yellow. They're going to crack. I'm going to lose a few. They're going to turn to dust. And in that little moment of soul searching, it occurred to me the only way that I can keep them forever is to burn them. and one by one I burned each of the 6 talismans. And that was a major magical act. Now that seems sort of like a very self-centered and narcissistic thing to do, but in magic, you not only have to evoke a force, as I had to evoke the spiritual entities inherent in each of those talismans, but somehow or other you have to reabsorb it. Otherwise, why are you doing it? The magician only has the magician to work with. So anything that is made of a talismanic nature has to be somehow or other reabsorbed. The perfect example of that is the host wine at an Orthodox Catholic Church service or Roman Catholic Church service. That's just a little piece of styrofoam thin bread and regular wine and water that they're using. But in the course of the ceremony, the priest is acting as a magician to charge those elements as talismans, to literally put, in their way of thinking, the body and blood of Christ into those elements, and then reabsorbing. It's the Eucharist is one of the highest of the talismanic processes. Another way to treat a talisman when it comes time to charge it is to treat it as a candidate in an initiation. A candidate in an initiation is blindfolded at first and completely in the dark. So the talisman itself is wrapped in a black cloth, as if it was a candidate just getting ready to come in. And then the candidate in an initiation is bound by an oath. I promise to do this and that, and if I don't do this and that, may my ears be cut off and shoved up my nose and all of this terrible things. It's a little hard to do that with an inanimate object, but instead you give it a charge. Hello, Mr. Talisman, I created you to do such and such and such and such. It is your job to do such and such and such and such, and by all of the names of the divine entities on this thing, by golly, you're going to do it. Okay? So you're still treating it like a candidate. Then you take it out of its bag. Then you consecrate it, or you consecrate it with fire and water, and you purify it and banish it, and then invoke the forces into the thing, and then you wrap it in a new bag. Say if it's a planetary talisman of Mars, perhaps you'd put it in a red bag now, and that's like the candidate receiving their jewels, or the candidate receiving the new clothes that they wear as a full-fledged initiate. So talismans are usually treated as candidates in an initiation ceremony. It's a replica of the Sigillum de Ameth of Dr. John Dee, and that's a real good example of a panticle, because absolutely everything in the cosmos is poured onto that one very, very complex symbol. And it sort of looks at the universe as sevens nested inside of sevens, inside of sevens, inside of sevens. And the individual components of that could be considered talismans, specific subdivisions of that great whole. There's another example of a panticle. This is my personal panticle. Like I said, a panticle is the magician's worldview. And here we have 4 versions of the Kabbalistic tree of life. And there's a tree of life for each of the 4 Kabbalistic worlds. And each of those 4 Kabbalistic worlds is an embodiment of the powers and energies in the Yod, He, Vav, He formula. It's more than a deity, it's a formula. And the 4 trees of life all spring from, they're all joined at the top, because each tree of life is just an expression of that one. In other words, as we move out, we're moving away from the light. It's like light is being slowed down and finally becoming matter at the very ends of this. So this would be a panticle. But the individual Sephira would be on the line of a talisman, because they have a specific neat little package of forces, subdivision of forces that are just part of the tree of life. You could capture one of those, and the spirits and intelligences that inhabit that particular sephira, capture that into a talisman and carry it around in your shoe.
Quite incredible perfection. It marks the furthest southern extent of the Egyptian Empire during the time of Ramses, which is about 11 something. He reigned for 66 years, so it's most of the 12th century, or a big chunk of the 12th century. The reasons for building it here, well, it marks as I said, it marks the southern extent of the empire. And he's not exactly saying beware. He's not really saying, I mean, the king is not, it looks like boasting, but it's not boasting. Basically what he's saying is that here the forces of light begin. What it represents esoterically is, and this is by common agreement as well, I mean the Egyptologists wouldn't really disagree with that, it's the king as a god, the king as the realization, put it this way, the king is If you followed this series from beginning to end, you should now have a very different view of Egypt than you had when you started watching the series. Egypt is not a civilization barely emerging out of primitivism, worshipping an incoherent pantheon of gods and devoid of science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and so on. It is in fact a civilization in all important respects more advanced than ourselves, from which we have much to learn and not so much to contribute. The overriding theme behind Egypt that fueled Egypt through 3,000 years of almost uninterrupted peace, prosperity, and religion was the doctrine of immortality, the idea that we human beings are of divine origin, and through our own internal efforts we can re-establish within ourselves that connection, and ourselves become divine. The embodiment of that principle was the pharaoh himself, and here we see Ramses II, one of the very greatest of the Egyptian pharaohs, certainly its most prodigious builders, proclaiming himself in that guise. So here at Abu Simbel, on the great days of October 22nd and February 22nd, supposedly the birthday and coronation day of the king himself, we see a phenomenon that is, you might call, the physical manifestation of illumination. So here at Abu Simbel, we will be looking at this principle of immortality, at the sacred science, at the idea of illumination, which is not contingent upon electricity, as our modern scholars seem to think.
A lost tale, hidden in the stones. Blueprints of a lost art, from a lost world. Behind the veil lies another Egypt, hidden in Egypt. Magical Egypt.
A work of stupendous magnitude.